The rain has not started yet, but you can already smell it. You're standing inside a wooden structure taller than a 4-story building, and every single sound around you is alive. Something massive shifts its weight 2 levels above your head. Somewhere close, low, and unmistakable comes the sound of a lion breathing in its sleep. There is no leash, no cage door with a lock you control, just wooden partitions, and trust, and a silence that feels like it is being held on purpose. And then you hear it. A sound from outside, at the only entrance this structure has. It is sealing itself shut, not from the inside, not by human hands. From the outside by something you cannot see. Closing a door, you were never given the chance to close yourself. And in exactly 1,000 seconds, you are going to understand exactly why that single detail should terrify you more than the storm that is about to start. Genesis tells you Noah built an ark. Sunday school gives you a cartoon boat, 2 of every animal, a rainbow at the end. What it doesn't tell you is that the vessel you are standing inside right now was never built to go anywhere. It has no rudder, no sail, no destination programmed into its design at all. It was built for exactly one purpose: to not flip over, to not break apart, to keep every living thing inside it alive long enough for something on the outside to finish what it started. Welcome to the year that erased almost everyone on Earth, and the 371 days that decided who was left. Read Genesis chapter 7 closely, and there is one sentence almost every retelling of this story quietly skips past, because it is the most unsettling detail in the entire account. Noah did not close the door. Every children's book, every painting, every dramatic film version shows Noah standing at the entrance, ushering the last animal inside, then pulling the door shut himself. A man taking control of his own fate at the final possible moment. That is not what the text says. The text says God shut him in, not Noah, not his sons. A sealing performed entirely from the outside, by a hand none of them controlled, at a moment none of them chose. Sit with that for 1 second, because once you notice it, you cannot unnotice it. This was not a formality. This was the single most irreversible moment in the entire flood narrative, and the man the story is actually about does not get to be the one who does it. Think about what that means for the 7 people trapped inside with him. Once that door sealed, there was no reopening it from within to double-check a forgotten tool, no cracking it for fresh air on a bad night, no letting in a neighbor who changed his mind at the last possible hour and came running through the mud, pounding on the wood, begging. The text is unambiguous about the timeline. The sealing happens, and then 7 days later, the rain begins. 7 days of total silence before the catastrophe, locked inside a structure with no way out, waiting for a sound that has not started yet. Picture what those 7 days must have actually felt like from inside that sealed hull. No rain yet, no storm yet, just absolute silence pressing against wooden walls. 8 people left alone with nothing to do but wait for a catastrophe they had been promised was already coming, with no way to know exactly which hour it would finally arrive. Now ask yourself the question this video is going to keep circling back to again and again, because it is the real engine underneath this entire ancient account. Why would a story about salvation begin with a detail this deliberately terrifying? Why remove agency from the one man the story is supposed to be honoring? Here is the answer almost nobody gives you, and it reframes everything that follows. This was never a story about a man saving himself through cleverness. It is a story about a man who built exactly what he was told to build, prepared exactly the way he was told to prepare, and then surrendered every remaining decision to something outside his control. The door was not sealed by God as a threat. It was sealed as a mercy. Because if the choice had remained open, human nature guarantees it would have been used. Someone would have opened it. for a neighbor, for a possession left behind, for one more attempt to reason with people who had already run out of time. The sealed door was not the beginning of Noah's imprisonment. It was the end of every temptation to undo what had already been decided. And this single detail is about to matter again later in this account. In a moment, almost no one connects to it, because the Hebrew word used for this vessel, the word teva, appears in only one other place in the entire Bible. And what it is describing there should make the hair on your arms stand up the moment you hear it. But before we get to that connection, you need to understand something about the vessel itself that should already be bothering you. Because if this was truly a rescue mission, if God wanted these 8 people and every one of these animals to survive, the ship they were sealed inside should have been built for speed, for navigation, for control. It was built for none of those things. And what it was actually built for is stranger than anything a Sunday school lesson ever prepared you to hear. Here is the specification God gave Noah, laid out with an almost engineering manual precision that should stop you immediately. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Translate that into modern measurement and you get a vessel roughly 135 meters long, longer than a modern soccer field, taller than a 4-story building, with a length-to-width ratio of exactly 6:1. Now here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you, because it is not folklore. It is naval engineering. That exact ratio, 6:1, is not random, and it is not primitive. It is the same length-to-width proportion modern naval engineers use today, when designing vessels meant to survive extreme chaotic seas without capsizing. Not for speed, not for cutting efficiently through water toward a destination, for one purpose only: stability in violent, directionless chaos. A man living roughly 4,000 years before naval architecture existed as a formal discipline was given a blueprint that modern engineers would later independently arrive at. Through centuries of trial, error, and mathematics, Noah never had access to. Modern replicas built to test this ratio, including a full-scale wooden reconstruction completed in the Netherlands in the 21st century, have confirmed the same finding engineers predicted from the numbers alone. A hull this proportion rides remarkably steady in rough water, resisting capsizing even when struck broadside by waves that would roll a narrower, faster vessel completely over. Sit with that for a moment, because it should completely change how you picture this vessel. Delete the image of a curved wooden boat with a pointed bow cutting through waves like something racing toward a shore. This structure was something closer to a massive rectangular barge, a floating box built with exactly one job: do not flip, do not break, do not sink, no matter what direction the chaos comes from. And here is where the account becomes genuinely strange, because Noah's Ark was given something every other seafaring vessel in human history has been built around from the very beginning. It had no rudder. Think about what that actually means. Every ship ever built by human hands, from the earliest reed boats on the Nile to the naval architecture of empires, was designed around the ability to steer, to choose a direction, correct a course, decide where to go next. Noah's Ark had none of that. No rudder, no sail catching wind toward a destination, no means of navigation whatsoever built into its design. Why would God command the construction of an enormous, meticulously engineered vessel, and then deliberately remove the one feature every other ship in history considers essential? Because this vessel was never meant to go anywhere. It was meant to survive, being nowhere. There was no shore to aim for, no coordinates to reach. The entire visible world was being erased, and steering toward a destination was not the problem that needed solving. Staying upright while everything else on Earth fell apart was the only problem that mattered. And the 6:1 ratio, the rudderless hull, the sealed door, all of it points toward the same terrifying conclusion. This was not a rescue vehicle in the way you have always pictured one. It was a survival capsule. built to endure, not to escape. Built to hold its position against forces no navigation system could have outmaneuvered anyway. And once you understand that, the next detail hits differently, because the material this survival capsule was built from is not something modern botanists, historians, or biblical scholars have ever been able to fully identify. And the Bible only tells you its name exactly one single time in the entire text, with no further explanation given anywhere else. That word is gopher. And nobody, not one expert in thousands of years, can tell you with certainty what it actually means. Say the word out loud. Gopher wood. It sounds almost comfortable, familiar, like something you could look up and picture immediately. You cannot, because in the entire library of Scripture, every book, every chapter, every generation of scribes copying and recopying the text for thousands of years, the phrase gopher wood appears exactly one single time. Genesis chapter 6, verse 14. And then it vanishes from the text completely, never mentioned again, never clarified, never cross-referenced anywhere else in the entire Bible. Here is what that means in practice, and it should genuinely bother you. No translator, no rabbi, no biblical scholar in thousands of years of continuous study has ever been able to say with certainty what tree this word is actually describing. Some translations guess cypress, based on similarities to other ancient Mediterranean shipbuilding woods. Some argue for cedar, prized across the ancient Near East for its natural resistance to rot and insects. Others point toward teak, a wood so dense and water-resistant that it remained a top choice for naval construction well into the modern era. And then there is the theory that unsettles scholars the most. That gopher was never the name of a tree species at all. That it was describing a process, a specific method of chemically treating ordinary wood to make it resistant to water, rot, and structural failure over the course of more than a year, submerged in violent churning floodwater. Think about what that theory implies, if it is correct. It means the ark's true innovation was never the tree it came from. It means somewhere in the ancient world, someone possessed a treatment process advanced enough that the only word available to describe it, thousands of years later, was simply the name of the wood it produced. A technology significant enough to be singled out by name, and specific enough that it never needed repeating anywhere else in Scripture. Because whoever originally heard this account already understood exactly what it meant. And we have lost that meaning completely. Every reader for the last several thousand years has been staring at a single, isolated word, describing a material engineered specifically to survive an event unlike anything before or since. And none of us can tell you exactly what it actually was. Here is a detail that makes this mystery even stranger, and almost no version of this story ever mentions it. Ancient Near Eastern shipbuilders of Noah's era typically worked with woodcut, shaped and joined for vessels no longer than a few dozen meters. Modest river craft and coastal boats, nothing close to the scale being described here. A structure 135 meters long, built from a single unidentified material, needed something ordinary. Timber could not reliably provide across 3 stacked decks under that much accumulated weight and pressure. Consistent structural integrity across an almost unimaginable span, without warping, splitting, or buckling under the strain of holding thousands of living creatures above open, churning water for over a year. Whatever gopher actually was, it had to behave less like a single tree species and more like an engineered material. Which is exactly why the theory pointing toward a treatment process, rather than a specific tree, keeps resurfacing among scholars who take this account seriously, instead of dismissing it as primitive folklore. And that raises an uncomfortable question this video keeps circling back to. If the pre-flood world possessed the knowledge to produce a building material this advanced, what else did it know that we have never recovered even a fragment of. And that question about what advanced knowledge the pre-flood world may have quietly possessed connects directly to something almost nobody expects. A warning system built entirely without modern instruments, relying instead on two birds, sent out one at a time, to answer a question no human being inside that sealed vessel could otherwise verify. Was the world outside actually safe again? Or was it still a graveyard pretending to be dry ground? Now hold on to that unresolved mystery, because the very next instruction God gives Noah makes the ark's engineering problem even larger. Whatever this wood actually was, it needed help. Something needed to be applied to it, inside and out, in a quantity large enough that historians who study it today believe it points towards something almost nobody associates with the ancient world. Massive deliberate extraction of crude oil. Before the flood came, before a single drop of rain fell, Noah had to solve a problem that should have been physically impossible for a family of 8 to solve alone. God's instruction was specific down to an almost obsessive level of detail. Cover the ark in pitch, inside and out. Not a light coating. A complete seal covering every surface, every seam, every joint in a structure larger than most buildings standing today. Historians who have run the numbers on a project this size arrive at a conclusion that should stop you cold. Sealing a vessel this massive would have required an amount of natural bitumen or crude asphalt on a scale that implies something almost nobody pictures existing in the ancient pre-flood world. Large-scale extraction of raw petroleum, seeping up from the earth itself, gathered in quantities large enough to waterproof a floating structure the size of a small stadium. Sit with that, because it means the world Noah lived in was not the primitive stick-and-mud civilization most retellings imply. It was a world capable of locating, harvesting, and applying an industrial-scale natural resource generations before recorded history claims anyone understood what crude oil even was. And once that seal was complete, once the ark became a fully enclosed vessel with no windows for sunlight and no opening for fresh air, Noah's family faced an entirely new problem. They were about to spend more than a year sealed inside complete darkness, floating through a catastrophe with no sun, no moon, no visible sky at all. Genesis gives you one word for how that problem was solved: Zohar, translated in almost every modern Bible simply as window. That translation is where almost every version of this story stops looking closely enough, because ancient rabbinic tradition, commentary passed down for thousands of years by scholars who read this text in its original Hebrew, insists that Zohar was never describing a hole cut into wood to let sunlight through. There was no sunlight to let through. The entire sky above them was gone, swallowed by storm and floodwater for months at a time. What Jewish mystical tradition claims Noah actually possessed instead is something that should raise the hair on your arms the moment you hear it. A luminous stone. A glowing gem or a radiant object with no external fuel source, no flame, no wick, something that produced its own light from within continuously for the entire duration of the flood, illuminating the darkest structure ever built by human hands during the darkest year in human history. Think about what that claim is actually suggesting, because it is stranger than almost anything else in this account. Not fire, which needs oxygen and fuel and constant tending inside a sealed wooden vessel, already dangerously packed with animals and flammable material. A separate category of light altogether, self-sustained, independent of combustion. The kind of detail that sounds less like ancient poetic imagination and more like a description someone was doing their genuine best to explain, using the only vocabulary available to them at the time. Some researchers studying this tradition point out that certain deep-sea and cave-dwelling organisms today produce their own light through bioluminescence, entirely without fire or external fuel, a naturally occurring phenomenon that at least demonstrates self-generated light is not scientifically impossible, even if nothing on the scale tradition describes for Noah's stone has ever been documented in the modern world. And here is the question. This detail should leave sitting with you unresolved, because the text never fully answers it. If Noah needed a self-sustaining light source to survive complete sealed darkness for over a year, where did something like that even come from in a civilization that supposedly had no advanced technology at all? The honest answer might be closer than you think, because according to a text your Bible quotes by name but never fully hands you, the corruption that caused this entire flood in the first place did not come from ordinary human wickedness alone. It came from somewhere significantly stranger. And the being who warned Noah about what was coming was not a voice in a dream. It was an archangel sent secretly, before anyone else on earth knew judgment had already been decided. Sunday school gives you a simple explanation for the flood. People became wicked. God became sorrowful. The waters came as punishment for sin, the way a parent finally runs out of patience. That explanation is not wrong. It is incomplete. And the missing piece comes from a text you have already heard about. If you watched what we uncovered in the seven heavens, the same account quoted directly by name in the book of Jude, the same text found preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls in 20 separate copies. The book of Enoch does not describe the flood as a simple moral cleansing. It describes something closer to a biological emergency. Here is the detail almost no retelling of Noah's story includes, and once you hear it, the entire flood account reads completely differently. According to this text, a group of angelic beings called the Watchers abandoned their assigned post in the heavens and descended to earth, not to observe humanity, but to take human wives. Their offspring were not ordinary children. The text calls them Nephilim and describes them as giants, violent beyond anything the pre-flood world had ever produced, consuming resources and destroying life at a scale that pushed all of creation toward collapse. Some apocryphal fragments go even further, describing the fallen Watchers teaching forbidden knowledge alongside this biological corruption, early metallurgy for crafting weapons, cosmetic arts for seduction, and techniques of enchantment that spread through human society far faster than any purely physical threat could have on its own. Under this reading, the pre-flood world was not simply violent. It was being systematically re-engineered, generation by generation, by beings who were never supposed to touch it at all. And here is where the account becomes something closer to horror than folklore. Apocryphal tradition claims the corruption did not stop with humanity. The fallen Watchers, according to these texts, crossed species boundaries that were never meant to be crossed, creating biological abominations among animals as well as humans. A genetic contamination spreading through the created order itself. Think about what that claim actually implies about the flood's true purpose. If this tradition is accurate, God was not simply punishing bad behavior. He was responding to something closer to an engineered biological catastrophe, a corruption embedded directly into the genetic fabric of life on Earth, requiring something far more drastic than moral correction to fully remove. This reframes a detail in Genesis that most readers skim past without a second thought. Why did land animals also need to be destroyed in the flood, not just corrupted humanity? Under the traditional Sunday school reading, that detail makes little sense. Animals do not sin. But under this older tradition, it makes uncomfortable, horrifying sense. If the corruption had spread into animal populations as well, a targeted judgment against humanity alone would have left the contamination intact, spreading forward into every future generation of life on Earth. The flood, under this reading, was not only justice, it was quarantine. And this is exactly why Noah needed advance warning, specific enough to build a vessel this precisely engineered, this far in advance of the actual event. According to the Book of Enoch, that warning did not come through a dream or a vague premonition. It came through a direct, deliberate intervention. The archangel Uriel, sent specifically to warn Noah of what was coming before the corruption reached its final, irreversible point. Which means the ark itself was never just a boat. It was a firewall. A deliberately sealed, deliberately isolated vessel, built to preserve one uncorrupted bloodline and a carefully selected set of uncorrupted animal lineages, while everything touched by that contamination was permanently erased from the earth. And that reframing should make you look differently at the animals themselves, because the way they entered the ark was far stranger and far more specific than 2 by 2 ever fully explained. Almost everyone alive today can recite this detail from memory, and almost everyone alive today is reciting it wrong. 2 by 2. It is the single most repeated phrase from this entire story, printed on nursery wallpaper, sung in children's songs, painted onto the sides of arks made of plastic and cardboard. And it is not what the text actually says. Read Genesis chapter 7 closely, and a second, far stranger instruction appears, one that almost no popular retelling includes. Of every clean animal, and of every bird, without exception, Noah was told to take 7 pairs, not 2, 7. Only the animals classified as unclean received the simple, memorable count of 2 by 2 that ended up defining this story in popular imagination for thousands of years. Sit with that discrepancy for a second, because it should immediately raise a question the text does not directly answer, but strongly implies. Why would a story about pure survival need 7 pairs of some animals and only 1 pair of others? If the sole purpose was repopulating the earth afterward, every species would need the exact same minimum viable population to avoid extinction. The uneven numbers only make sense if something else was happening inside that ark beyond simple preservation. Here is the explanation that connects every piece of this puzzle together, and it is almost never mentioned outside serious biblical scholarship. The larger number of clean animals existed because Noah was going to need them for something specific, the moment the flood ended: sacrifice and food. A single breeding pair cannot be immediately used for either purpose without risking the entire species' survival. 7 pairs could. It meant Noah stepped off that mountain with both an offering ready for God and a food source ready for his family, without gambling the future of a single species to get either one. Now, here is the second detail that should completely change how you picture the scale of this operation, because it solves a problem that skeptics have used against this story for centuries. How could one wooden vessel possibly hold 2 of every animal species alive on Earth today? From elephants to hummingbirds to millions of distinct insect classifications. It could not, and it did not need to. Ancient Hebrew thought organized the animal kingdom around a concept scholars call baramin. Created kinds, not the millions of hyper-specific species modern biological taxonomy tracks today. Under this framework, Noah did not need a breeding pair of wolves, a separate pair of coyotes, and a separate pair of foxes. He needed one ancestral canine pair, carrying within it the full genetic potential to diversify over the following centuries into every canine species alive on Earth right now. The same logic applies across the animal kingdom. A comparatively small number of ancestral kinds, each one holding enough genetic range to explain the staggering biological diversity that exists today. And this same framework raises a question almost no retelling of this story dares to ask directly. What about creatures? modern science associates only with a prehistoric past long before humans supposedly existed at all. Some biblical researchers point to the book of Job's description of a massive creature called Behemoth, with a tail compared to a cedar tree and bones like bars of iron. As a description that reads less like a hippopotamus, the modern explanation most translators default to, and more like something with no living modern equivalent at all. If ancient civilizations coexisted with creatures conventional timelines insist went extinct tens of millions of years before any human walked the earth, the Ark's guest list may have needed room for passengers far stranger than lions and sheep. Suddenly, the impossible logistics problem shrinks dramatically. Suddenly, a wooden vessel 135 meters long stops sounding like fantasy and starts sounding like a project with actual calculable numbers behind it. But even with that number reduced, one problem remains completely unsolved, and it is the problem that should be bothering you the most right now. However many ancestral pairs Noah actually loaded onto that ark, he still needed to feed every single one of them, keep predator away from prey inside cramped wooden compartments, and manage waste from thousands of animals for 371 days, sealed inside a vessel with no way to restock supplies, no way to let anything out, and absolutely no room for error. There is only one explanation ancient Jewish tradition offers for how that logistics problem was actually solved. And it does not involve constant feeding at all. It involves something closer to a controlled, divinely timed sleep. Do the math on this problem honestly, and it should stop you completely. Even reduced down to ancestral kinds instead of millions of modern species, Noah's family still would have faced an impossible daily task: feeding thousands of animals, separating predator from prey inside cramped wooden compartments, and managing waste on a scale that should have overwhelmed 8 human beings within weeks, let alone 371 days. 8 people, no modern refrigeration, no automated systems, no outside deliveries. And somehow, according to the text, they emerged from that vessel having succeeded completely. Ancient Jewish tradition offers an explanation for this that rarely makes it into any popular retelling of this story, and it should genuinely unsettle you the moment you hear it. Rabbinic commentary on this passage suggests that many of the animals inside the ark did not remain fully awake and active for the entire voyage. Instead, they describe something closer to an induced deep metabolic dormancy, a state resembling hibernation brought on by the sudden catastrophic collapse of daylight temperature and the natural rhythms every living creature depends on to stay active. Think about what that would have actually looked like from the inside. Not a chaotic wooden zoo full of roaring, starving, panicking animals fighting for space and food in complete darkness. Something closer to a held breath. Rows of massive, dangerous creatures slowed down to something resembling sleep, their bodies conserving energy through processes science would not have language for until thousands of years later. While 8 terrified humans moved quietly between them in the dark, tending to what needed tending and leaving the rest undisturbed. This single detail solves multiple problems in the account simultaneously. And that is exactly why it deserves your attention instead of your skepticism. It explains how 8 people could have managed a logistics operation that should have required hundreds. It explains how natural predators and prey could have coexisted for over a year in close proximity without a single recorded incident of violence inside the ark. And it explains why the text places almost no narrative weight on the day-to-day management of thousands of animals. because inside that sealed floating darkness, most of them were, quite literally, not fully there. There is a second layer to this explanation that deserves your attention, because it answers a question skeptics raise constantly about this account. What about the smell? What about the sheer volume of waste thousands of large animals would produce over 371 sealed days, with nowhere for it to go? If the dormancy tradition is accurate, that problem shrinks dramatically as well. A metabolism slowed to near hibernation does not just conserve energy. It conserves everything: reduced feeding, reduced waste, reduced heat, reduced oxygen consumption, all at once. In the exact combination, a sealed wooden vessel with limited ventilation would have desperately needed to remain survivable for its human occupants. It is almost as if every single detail the text leaves unexplained points toward the same quiet, deliberate design. Not chaos, barely contained by improvisation, but a system engineered from the very beginning to require far less from 8 exhausted human beings than the raw numbers should have ever allowed. But dormant animals and a family of 8 were not floating through empty, silent water. Outside those sealed wooden walls, an event was unfolding that the text describes in a way almost nobody reads closely enough to notice, because the flood that erased the pre-flood world was never described as simple rainfall. It came from somewhere far stranger and far more violent. Genesis tells you the flood came from 2 directions at once, and most readers skip past the second one entirely because it sounds almost like a throwaway detail. The text says, the windows of heaven opened. Rain, the part everyone remembers. But it also says something else happened simultaneously. The fountains of the great deep burst open. Read that phrase slowly, because it is not describing weather. It is describing something breaking open from beneath the earth itself. Subterranean water reservoirs, ocean floors, ancient sealed pressure points, rupturing all at once, on a scale that suggests catastrophic tectonic activity happening in perfect synchronization with the storm above. This was never simple rainfall overflowing riverbanks. This was the earth itself failing structurally, from below and above at exactly the same moment. And here is the detail that should completely reframe how you think about this story's origin. Because this catastrophic flood account did not appear only in the Bible. Roughly 1,000 years before Genesis was compiled into the form you read today, Mesopotamian scribes were already carving a strikingly similar account into wet clay. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a man named Utnapishtim, warned in advance by a god, instructed to build a massive sealed vessel, loading it with his family and animals before a devastating flood erases the world outside. A raven is sent out to check for land, then a dove. The parallels are not vague or symbolic. This is exactly the kind of detail that separates careful ancient testimony from careless invention. A raven that returns having found nothing worth landing on, and only after that, a dove sent out again days later, coming back the second time with fresh green growth still gripped in its beak. Undeniable proof that vegetation had already begun reclaiming the drowned world below. Consider what that timing detail alone tells you about the account's internal consistency. A story invented carelessly would not bother distinguishing between a scavenger bird finding nothing and a clean bird returning empty-handed the first time, then successfully bearing proof of life the second. The parallels are not vague or symbolic. They are structurally, almost line for line, identical to Noah's account. An even older Mesopotamian text, the Atrahasis, tells essentially the same story from a different angle, describing divine anger provoked by the overwhelming noise of a rapidly multiplying humanity and a specific command to seal a vessel with pitch, exactly the same waterproofing method Noah was instructed to use on the ark. And then, in 2014, a discovery made this connection impossible to dismiss as coincidence. A British museum researcher named Irving Finkel successfully translated a 3,700-year-old cuneiform tablet, now known as the Ark tablet, describing in startling technical detail the construction of a massive Mesopotamian flood vessel, not shaped like a modern ship at all. A colossal circular coracle, woven from rope in a design historians had never previously connected to any biblical account, complete with precise measurements for its rope length and construction materials. The tablet's measurements were precise enough that naval historians have since attempted to model exactly how a vessel of that description would have behaved on open water, a design radically different from anything in the biblical account, yet clearly describing the same core memory. A sealed, waterproofed vessel, built on divine warning, carrying a family and animals through a flood meant to end the world. Here is the question this discovery leaves sitting directly in your lap, because there is no comfortable, simple answer to it. If these accounts are all independent inventions from unrelated ancient cultures, why do they converge so precisely? A sealed, pitch-covered vessel, a bird sent to test for dry land, animals loaded in pairs, an angry flood erasing a corrupted world? And if they are not independent inventions, if they instead point back toward a single shared historical memory passed down separately through different civilizations after a real catastrophic event, what does that say about how much of this story actually happened exactly as ancient people across the entire world remembered it? Because Mesopotamia is far from the only place this memory survived. This same catastrophic flood and the same handful of survivors on a floating vessel appears again and again across cultures that had no possible contact with each other at all. Here is a number that should genuinely stop you, because it is not a rounded estimate from a single enthusiastic researcher. Anthropologists cataloging flood mythology across human civilization have identified well over 300 separate cultures scattered across every inhabited continent on Earth that preserve some version of the exact same story. A catastrophic, world-ending flood. A small group of survivors, specifically warned in advance. Some form of vessel built to endure what was coming. And again, animals saved alongside them. Think about what that pattern actually requires, because coincidence stops being a reasonable explanation once the scale gets this large. In Hindu tradition, a man named Manu is warned by a divine fish, builds a boat, and survives a flood that destroys the rest of humanity. In Chinese mythology, the story of Gunyu describes a devastating flood requiring generations of engineered effort to control and survive. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, isolated from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years by ocean on every side, preserve their own independent flood narratives with surveyors and vessels. Mesoamerican traditions describe the same core structure. In one Aztec account, a couple named Tata and Nena are warned in advance by a god. Hollow out an enormous cypress log and survive a flood that drowns the rest of humanity. Right down to the detail of being warned not to look back at the destruction behind them. A command that echoes forward, thousands of years later, into a far more famous biblical story involving a burning city and a pillar of salt. None of these cultures had contact with each other. None of them shared written language, trade routes, or migration paths close enough to explain a borrowed story. So ask the question this pattern forces you to confront directly. If these are all separate inventions, why does human imagination, completely independently, keep landing on the exact same catastrophe? Modern geology offers one possible answer, and it is stranger than pure mythology because it points toward an actual, datable, physical event. Researchers William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed what has become known as the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. Evidence that around 5,600 years before the modern era, rising Mediterranean waters catastrophically breached the natural barrier at the Bosphorus Strait, sending a wall of salt water flooding into the freshwater basin that is now the Black Sea. Entire coastal settlements, entire fertile valleys, submerged within what geological evidence suggests was a shockingly short window of time. Weeks, not centuries. For any community living along that ancient coastline, watching their entire known world disappear beneath rising salt water. In the span of a single generation, this would not have been a symbolic warning about morality. It would have been the literal end of everything they understood their world to be. And a memory catastrophic enough could easily have traveled outward from that single point, carried by migration and trade over centuries, mutating slightly in each retelling until it resurfaced independently in the mythology of dozens of separate cultures who never remembered exactly where the story originally came from. Here is what that possibility means for the account you have been following through this entire video. The Genesis flood may not be an isolated, unprovable religious claim standing alone against modern science. It may be one specific culture's remembered, theologically framed record of something that actually physically happened to human civilization. An event severe enough to imprint itself into the collective memory of the entire ancient world, surfacing again and again, thousands of miles apart, in cultures that had no way to compare notes. And once the water finally receded in Noah's own account, the ark did not simply drift to safety on flat, forgettable ground. It came to rest somewhere the Bible describes with far more geographic ambiguity than almost anyone realizes. And the physical search for exactly where that resting place actually is has produced one of the strangest ongoing mysteries in modern biblical archaeology. Say the phrase Mount Ararat out loud to almost anyone familiar with this story, and they will picture one specific peak, a single snow-capped mountain in eastern Turkey, the place every illustration and every documentary confidently claims the ark came to rest. Here is the detail that should immediately make you question that confidence. Genesis never actually says that. Read the text itself, and the language is deliberately broader than the popular version of this story ever admits. The ark rests, according to Genesis, upon the mountains of Ararat, plural, describing an entire ancient mountainous region once known as Urartu, not a single named peak. That is the geographic equivalent of someone claiming a shipwreck happened at a specific dock in New York City, when the original record only said somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. The popular version of this story has been quietly narrowing an entire mountain range down to one convenient, paintable peak for centuries. So where does the actual physical mystery come in? Because there is one, and it does not involve the mountain everyone already pictures. Roughly 30 kilometers south of that famous peak sits a geological formation known as Durupinar, and its shape is the reason it has generated intense debate for decades. Seen from above, it forms an unmistakable boat-shaped outline embedded into the landscape, measuring almost exactly the same length as the ark described in Genesis. Close to 150 meters. Not an approximate resemblance. A specific, measurable match to a specific, measurable biblical description. Mainstream geologists classify the formation as a naturally occurring feature, formed through ordinary tectonic and erosional processes that happen to have produced a boat-like silhouette. Researchers pushing the alternative case point to soil composition studies, claiming to detect elevated levels of processed materials consistent with ancient construction, along with additional formations nearby that some investigators have interpreted as fossilized ropes, anchor stones, and drainage systems positioned exactly where a vessel this size would have needed them. And the mystery does not end at ground level. Declassified reconnaissance photographs captured by American military aircraft in 1949 during the Cold War reveal an unusual oblong structure embedded beneath the ice near the northwest summit of the actual Mount Ararat. A formation intelligence analysts flagged decades ago as anomalous enough to warrant its own classified file. Multiple expeditions have since attempted to reach and document it, including a series of climbs in the 1980s led personally by James Irwin, the Apollo 15 astronaut who walked on the surface of the moon and later devoted years of his life to searching these slopes for physical confirmation of Noah's Ark. Turkish authorities have periodically restricted or monitored access to the upper slopes of Ararat itself, officially citing the politically sensitive, heavily militarized border region the mountain sits within. A restriction that, whether intentional or simply bureaucratic, has made independent, unsupervised verification of that 1949 anomaly nearly impossible for any research team ever since. None of these expeditions have produced conclusive, universally accepted proof. Alleged wood fragments recovered from various sites across the region have shown mineral petrification patterns, traces of iron and organic carbon compounds consistent with extremely old, waterlogged timber, but nothing that has satisfied the scientific community as definitive confirmation. Here is the question this leaves you with, unresolved, exactly the way the actual physical evidence leaves it unresolved. Is Durupinar a naturally formed illusion that happened to match an ancient story by pure geological coincidence? Or is it something else entirely, a structure quietly waiting in plain sight for thousands of years, 30 kilometers from the mountain everyone has been staring at instead? The Ark's story does not end the moment dry land appears either, because what happened after Noah stepped off that mountain contains one of the strangest, least discussed episodes in the entire Bible. A moment inside a tent that ancient rabbis interpreted in ways far darker than any children's Bible has ever dared to print. Every disaster movie needs an ending where the survivors finally breathe out. Noah's story gives you that moment: dry ground, an altar, a rainbow. And then, almost immediately afterward, it gives you something so uncomfortable that most children's Bibles simply skip it entirely. Genesis tells you Noah planted a vineyard, the first one recorded in human history, cultivated by the same man who had just spent 371 days keeping himself and everyone around him alive through absolute discipline and obedience. And then, in the very next verse, that same man is described drunk, unconscious, and naked inside his own tent. Here is where the account becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because what happens next has been debated by rabbis and scholars for thousands of years, and the debate itself should tell you something. Noah's son Ham enters the tent, sees his father in that state, and instead of covering him immediately, goes to tell his two brothers outside. When Noah wakes and somehow becomes aware of exactly what happened, he does not curse Ham directly. He curses Ham's son Canaan, an entire future bloodline, condemned because of something that happened in a tent, while Noah himself was unconscious. Think about how strange that reaction actually is on its own. A father waking from a drunken stupor, immediately possessing enough specific knowledge to issue a permanent, multi-generational curse against a grandson who was not even present in the tent. That is not the reaction of a man embarrassed about being seen unclothed. That is the reaction of a man who has learned something far worse happened to him while he had no ability to stop it. This is exactly why the Talmud, one of the most significant collections of rabbinic commentary in Jewish tradition, offers interpretations for this passage that go far beyond simple nakedness. Some rabbinic voices interpret the phrase describing what Ham did to his father as a euphemism for a violent physical act carried out while Noah was defenseless. Other interpretations point toward a deeper patriarchal betrayal, a symbolic castration of Noah's authority itself, an assault not just on his body, but on his position as the head of the only family left alive on earth. Whichever interpretation is closest to the original intent, the severity of the resulting curse only makes sense if something far darker than simple embarrassment actually took place inside that tent. And here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. This was the first family in the history of a completely emptied world. 8 people alone on an entire planet, and already within a single generation of stepping off that mountain, something happened inside that tent severe enough to fracture that family permanently, splitting one bloodline out from the other 2 with a curse that would echo for generations. If corruption could break through this fast, inside the one family specifically chosen to restart humanity, what does that tell you about whether the flood ever actually? Here is the question this leaves you with: unresolved. Exactly the way the actual physical evidence leaves it unresolved. Is Durupanar a naturally formed illusion that happened to match an ancient story by pure geological coincidence? Or is it something else entirely? A structure quietly waiting in plain sight for thousands of years, 30 kilometers from the mountain everyone has been staring at instead. The Ark's story does not end the moment dry land appears either. Because what happened after Noah stepped off that mountain contains one of the strangest, least discussed episodes in the entire Bible. A moment inside a tent that ancient rabbis interpreted in ways far darker than any children's Bible has ever dared to print. Every disaster movie needs an ending where the survivors finally breathe out. Noah's story gives you that moment. Dry ground, an altar, a rainbow. And then, almost immediately afterward, it gives you something so uncomfortable that most children's Bibles simply skip it entirely. Genesis tells you Noah planted a vineyard, the first one recorded in human history, cultivated by the same man who had just spent 371 days keeping himself and everyone around him alive through absolute discipline and obedience. And then, in the very next verse, that same man is described drunk, unconscious, and naked inside his own tent. Here is where the account becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because what happens next has been debated by rabbis and scholars for thousands of years, and the debate itself should tell you something. Noah's son Ham enters the tent, sees his father in that state, and instead of covering him immediately, goes to tell his 2 brothers outside. When Noah wakes and somehow becomes aware of exactly what happened, he does not curse Ham directly. He curses Ham's son, Canaan, an entire future bloodline, condemned because of something that happened in a tent while Noah himself was unconscious. Think about how strange that reaction actually is on its own. A father waking from a drunken stupor, immediately possessing enough specific knowledge to issue a permanent, multi-generational curse against a grandson who was not even present in the tent. That is not the reaction of a man embarrassed about being seen unclothed. That is the reaction of a man who has learned something far worse happened to him, while he had no ability to stop it. This is exactly why the Talmud, one of the most significant collections of rabbinic commentary in Jewish tradition, offers interpretations for this passage that go far beyond simple nakedness. Some rabbinic voices interpret the phrase describing what Ham did to his father as a euphemism for a violent physical act carried out while Noah was defenseless. Other interpretations point toward a deeper patriarchal betrayal, a symbolic castration of Noah's authority itself, an assault not just on his body, but on his position as the head of the only family left alive on Earth. Whichever interpretation is closest to the original intent, the severity of the resulting curse only makes sense if something far darker than simple embarrassment actually took place inside that tent. And here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. This was the first family in the history of a completely emptied world. 8 people alone on an entire planet, and already, within a single generation of stepping off that mountain, something happened inside that tent severe enough to fracture that family permanently, splitting one bloodline out from the other 2 with a curse that would echo for generations. If corruption could break through this fast, inside the one family specifically chosen to restart humanity, what does that tell you about whether the flood ever actually than you ever have before? Go back to the very beginning of this video, to the sealed door nobody could open from the inside, and hold on to that image for one more moment, because the ancient Hebrew word behind it is about to connect this entire story to something you have known since childhood, without ever realizing the two were linked at all. The word is teva. It is the word used for the vessel Noah built, and across the entire Hebrew Bible, it appears in exactly one other story: the basket that carried the infant Moses down the Nile River. Read that again, because this is not a loose poetic similarity. It is the exact same word used by the same original language, describing 2 objects that could not look more different on the surface. An enormous 3-story wooden structure built to survive a global catastrophe, and a small woven basket built to hide one helpless infant from a death sentence. And yet Scripture uses one single word for both. Think about what that connection is actually pointing toward. In both stories, a sealed vessel carries something precious through deadly water, completely at the mercy of forces outside anyone's control, toward a survival that depended entirely on something greater than human effort. Noah could not steer his ark. Moses' mother could not follow her son down the river. In both cases, the vessel had to be surrendered completely, sealed, and released into water that could just as easily have ended everything it carried. This is why this account has never simply been children's furniture in a nursery painting. It is a pattern appearing again at the very origin of the man who would later lead an entire enslaved nation out of bondage. The same word, the same surrender, the same impossible trust placed in a sealed vessel crossing deadly water. And once you see that pattern, this entire account should look different to you than it did 1,000 seconds ago. Not a simple story about animals boarding a boat 2 by 2, a precisely engineered survival vessel built from a material nobody today can fully identify, sealed with an industrial scale resource nobody expects from the ancient world, lit by a source of light. Tradition insists was never ordinary fire, carrying dormant animals through water that came from below the earth as much as from the sky above it, resting somewhere in a mountain range still being searched today, leading directly into a family scandal, dark enough to explain the beginning of Babel itself, and connected by a single shared word to the very basket that would later save the man who freed an entire people. 8 people stepped off that mountain into a completely erased world. Every single person alive on Earth right now descends from that number. Every detail this video has traced leads back to the same uncomfortable pattern. A story treated as simple enough for a child's bedroom wall, hiding engineering precision, biological catastrophe, unresolved archaeology, and family darkness specific enough that ancient rabbis spent centuries arguing over exactly what happened inside one tent. The version you were taught was never a lie. It was simply the smallest possible fraction of what the text actually contains. And the further this investigation goes, the more that original question from the very beginning of this video should feel different in your chest. Not, how could this story possibly be true? But how much of what actually happened did the text preserve? in compressed, careful language for people thousands of years later who would need to read between every single line just to recover it. If this is the first account from this channel that has opened something in you, go back and watch what we uncovered about the 7 heavens Enoch himself walked through. The same corruption, the same fallen watchers, the same warning seen from the other side of the sky instead of the deck of an ark. We are going to keep opening what the Bible only had room to mention once. Subscribe, because the next sealed word we open might be sitting somewhere in a story you have already read 100 times without ever seeing what was hiding inside it.